Welcome to Macroeconomics. Lecture 6 will study the economics of collective decision-making. First, it is important for us to take a look at the growth of the size of the U.S. government. Economists are sometimes interested in studying the effect that government has on the operation of the market system. As we looked at in the last lecture, the government is an institution that may help protect private property rights, enforce contracts, and provide public goods which are difficult to allocate through the private market. One way to measure the size of government is to measure total spending as a percent of the overall economy. That is, we take total government expenditures and divide by gross domestic product, which is the value of a country's economic output. Over the past century, however, the size of the U.S. government has exploded. In 1930, government expenditures accounted for only 9.4% of U.S. GDP. In 2008, government expenditures accounted for approximately 35.3% of total output. One thing that we should study is how market operations differ from collective action institutions like governments. Number one, we should notice that competitive behavior is present in both the market system and public sectors. For example, politicians must compete for votes by pushing for policies that assist in their re-election. And in the market system, consumer behavior in the market forces sellers to compete on prices and quality. Number two, public sector organization can break the individual consumption payment link. That is, governments can create a situation in which a person's consumption is not dependent on their ability to pay. Our third principle is that scarcity imposes the aggregate consumption/payment link in both sectors. That is, even if an individual is not paying for the goods, services, or transfers from the government, these items must be paid for by others. Number four, private sector action is based on voluntary mutual agreement, that is, free exchange between two willing parties. However, public sector action is based on majority rule and coercion. While market exchanges are voluntary for individuals engaging in the trade of goods and services, government actions are selected by majorities of voters and enforced with violence or the threat of violence through the use of government tools like police forces, courts, and militaries. Number five, voters must choose candidates that represent a bundle of goods, rather than choosing individual goods and services, as we often see in the free market operation. And number six, income and influence are distributed differently in the two sectors. Market transactions reward those that produce more value, but government allocation can be purely arbitrary. Next, we should take a look at how economists study political decision-making. That is really what public choice economics is about. It is a branch of economics that analyzes how decision-making affects the formation and operation of collective organizations like governments. Public choice scholars focus on the incentive structure of each actor in the collective action institution. So let's go through a few of the actors in the political sort of marketplace. First, we have voters, who have an incentive to choose politicians that they believe will provide them with the greatest net benefits. However, voters can be rationally ignorant. That is, the cost of finding information, reading newspapers, watching the news, and generally being informed can outweigh the benefit, or the very small probability that their vote will actually determine the outcome of an election. Continuing with the public choice analysis, we can look at the incentives of politicians. Politicians generally have an incentive to maximize the number of votes they receive in elections. They may have other motives as well, such as altruistic motives where they truly want to benefit society by picking the right policies, but they will need to secure a majority of votes first in order to influence policy making. And lastly, we have bureaucrats, which, depending on the organization, bureaucratic managers generally want to advance the goals and prestige of their bureaus and organizations. This manifests itself in budget maximization and attempts to increase their discretion or their power to use public resources. So we should ask, does the political process work? But economists find that when voters pay user fees for government services in proportion to the benefits they receive, and we're also assuming here that government action is productive, then all voters can gain from such a transaction. But in reality, it is very difficult to make users pay in proportion to the benefit they receive. Usually, voters will underestimate or understate the benefits they receive so that they do not have to pay as much in taxes or user fees. Finally, even though certain features of the government are desirable, we need to look at when the political process fails. Firstly, special interest groups can form to promote policies which have total costs that are greater than the total benefits. Politicians can also log roll or trade votes to pass more legislation, even if it leads to the inefficient allocation of resources. Also, pork barrel legislation is another concept, and it refers to a package of spending projects that benefit local areas but is financed through the federal government. These projects tend to have total costs that outweigh the concentrated benefits, but since the cost on each taxpayer is relatively small, they're able to get through the political process. Lastly, let's take a look at some more problems with government. One key feature we should look at is that politicians and voters often suffer from what is called the short-sightedness effect. This is when individuals focus on short-term benefits without looking at the long-term costs or unintended consequences of policies. For example, increasing the supply of money in the economy can increase GDP in the short term, but can lead to high inflation rates in the long run. Finally, rent-seeking may occur in the political process. Rent-seeking is when individuals and groups take action to influence public policy in order to gain personal benefits through redistribution. Industries may seek government handouts or contracts to help their companies at the expense of other voters.